All right, it's almost a minute over here, so we'll go ahead and get started for now. And as folks join, obviously they'll pick up right where we are. So today we're going to cover system and information integrity. It's the last section of our CMMC series, if you will. I think it's a really good one. It's one of the ones that is a little simpler to implement. It's got some clearly defined expectations. It's not too costly. So I think this one will be a good session. It is one of the shorter ones though, so we will likely finish a few minutes early. You guys that know me, we've been doing this together here for at least a year. Same agenda as normal. We're going to cover different guidance and practices. Same nomenclature and assumptions. Nothing has changed. The CMMC 2.0 model has not changed since last year. And important updates, no new important updates have come out. But again, I'll reiterate kind of what I've been reiterating each month, which is that the DoD is expecting to produce something around the March timeframe of next year. If that interim ruling comes through, that will dictate the timeline moving forward and expectations. If it doesn't happen, or they don't publish what was expected by March, that could delay things for another year. So again, we're all kind of in a waiting phase, but we're getting down to that last 90 days or so until we should hear some actual updates from DoD. Supplemental guidance here. So the system integrity specific resources, very few of them. So there's only 4 that you're going to have to reference. Again, a much easier domain than some of the others. And then only 7 individual practices. So as I normally do, I'm not going to read these to you. We're going to go through them one by one. But you can see this entire section is talking about malicious code, protection mechanisms. How do you monitor for it? How do you, for lack of better terms, respond to it? Those kinds of things. So in 14.1, we talk about how to identify, report, and correct system flaws. And system flaws is kind of ambiguous here. It depends on how you read it, what type of work you're in, what you're used to. Some folks will look at this as coding flaws. Some will look at it as misconfigurations in a system. Some could be vendor related. So there's kind of a wide variety of really what constitutes a system flaw. But at the bottom, you'll see that I put, there's 3 kind of typical ones that are the easiest way to try to bundle this together. There would be vulnerabilities that you find, any missing patches or updates, any common weaknesses or common vulnerabilities and exposures, CVEs. CVEs are the most probably common of any of these. If any of you have signed up for any type of alerting, any vendor announcements, you've procured a product, you know, your large vendors, for example, will send out emails and say, hey, a CVE such and such, and they'll give you a number which corresponds to the year and then the number of the actual item that was found in that year. And it tells you here's what you're susceptible to, here's the version of whatever product or application is susceptible, here's what you need to do to update it. These are the most common things that you're going to see. However, you might be in a role where you don't receive these. You're not the primary person who works with the vendor. Maybe you don't have a lot of vendors that you work with. So you're going to want to look at, how do I identify these flaws? Vulnerability scan reports, penetration testing, risk assessments, those are some of the easy ones because you can either do them internally or pay a third-party company to come in basically by outsourcing this. Incident response activities are a good one because if something happens, what was the symptom or flaw that potentially caused it? Basic system monitoring, this could be at the OS level, the hardware level, or application level, as well as with a SIM. Any system error codes and any code review you do. But the code review one specifically, I'm calling out as development related. So if you're not developing custom apps, you may not be, or most likely will not be doing any type of code review. So different types of flaws and how you can find them. But again, most of them are very low cost because the vulnerability scans, the pen testings, the risk assessments are not that high of cost. All you have to do is determine the frequency at which you're going to run them, and then how you're going to manage the flaws that you find via these avenues. Providing protection from malicious code at designated locations within the organization. This one's a little bit harder if you don't know what a designated location is. So from a NIST perspective, they're looking at entry and exit points. I've listed some here. These are clearly not every entry and exit point for every organization, but they're the most common, and you're likely to have one or more. So we could be talking about your firewall or a remote access server. A lot of infrastructures now that don't have, say, an on-prem infrastructure, the workstation is that entry point. Your mail servers, a lot of folks, are compromised via mail first, then web servers, proxy servers, and any mobile devices if you're allowing BYOD. So you have to take into consideration all of the types of designated locations, look at your organization specifically, and then determine which ones are applicable. And then moving forward, once you have that list, it's going to make it a lot easier to determine how are you logging these things, how are you monitoring, how are you combating the problems. But then what does NIST consider protection? At a high level, they really only call out a few items. Antivirus, and I would say anything that's in that antivirus, anti-malware type product suite. I wouldn't limit it specifically to antivirus. So you could have other products that bundle together, and antivirus is just one component. Maybe you have a file integrity monitoring, maybe you have a firewall component. So everything that could be kind of related to that type of product or suite of products. Configuration management, because this is obviously the practice with all of your processes that determine how you're configuring, how you're making changes, what impact those changes have, what flaws they potentially introduce. And then software integrity controls. The file integrity monitoring is a good one here. If you have a product that does that, and you can take a baseline of your systems or your assets, and then you can see what changes. You as the reviewer of those changes have the ability to go in and say, okay, I accept this and I'm going to make this part of my baseline, or I don't, and have the system revert back to its previous state. I don't see a lot of clients who go that route. One, because depending on the size of your organization and which product you use, it could be costly, but more common than anything else, it requires a lot of work. In previous organizations where I've implemented this tool, we could do this check weekly, and based on the number of systems we had, which were give or take, say 5,000, we could have 20,000 lines of code or rows within an Excel document that we have to go through and say, was this a valid change? And just, by the time you could ever get through 20,000 rows, the next report's already come in. So that just wasn't a feasible solution. If you're smaller and you have 25 hosts, this might be an absolutely fabulous technology to implement. Some other considerations, these are called out, but there's not a lot of guidance to how you're going to implement them. It's more so, don't forget these things when in your consideration. Having a trusted procurement process, the process itself, the people you deal with, the vendors you deal with, to make sure you're getting the right products and the right services from the right companies. So there's some form of security that can be implied. Secure coding practices, whether you're doing this in-house or outsourcing it, most developers are on a very tight timeline to produce code, deliver gate reviews. Security is often left out of that completely and as an afterthought. All of the research that's been done basically will show you that putting security into the coding practice from the start will make it cheaper, easier, and faster to deliver a secure product. However, the folks that are normally managing these products don't see it that way, because for the portion that they manage, it becomes more time consuming and more costly. And again, is often left out. If that's the case and you're dealing with one of these situations, you really need to consider static and dynamic code testing, so that you can see these code packages when they're in their binary form, as well as when they're running live, because you'll see some things in one test that you won't see in the other. And then you have to go through and kind of inventory what you have and say, are you buying a commercial off-the-shelf product, or what we refer to as COTS, versus custom applications and code? And one of the biggest things with the custom applications and code is that you potentially don't have the support for the security patches and updates and things of that nature. The other problem is, if you've used them for a long time, I've seen where code and applications could be 20 years old. The vendor may not even be in business anymore. It's a critical piece of software that your business relies on, but you have no way to upgrade it. And at some point, you're going to have to say, we as an organization have to pay to move ourselves over to a COTS product, or have something new developed. Given again the time, the complexity, the cost, most organizations delay that till they just can't delay it any longer. They usually wait to a point that there's a failure. Monitoring system security alerts and advisory and taking action. This is a unique one because there's no specific guidance about the number of alerts you should get, the frequency you should review them, how you should take action. I would say from a take action perspective, first and foremost, since we're really focusing on CMMC, I would say look at the contract that you're on and the requirements of the contract. Look at the agency you work for, whether it's DoD directly, it's a state or federal agency, whether you're a sub or prime. Look at those factors and say, has someone dictated a specific response, timeline, plan of action, a system that you use, a form that you fill out? Do that first so you're in compliance with your contract. Then beyond that, look at what's kind of common sense, logical, and easily to defend in court. For example, as you start to go through this and you look at if no one gives you a specific number of alerts that you should be receiving as far as vendors that provide these alerts or advisories, or a time that you should be notifying someone, you wouldn't want to go with the minimum and say, I'm only going to ingest one type of advisory and I'm going to report within a week. I don't know how many people would find that as kind of doing your due diligence and due care. So find that happy medium. You can go out to Department of Homeland Security, Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, CISO will put out advisories that you can sign up for. There's other ones, I think they're called CyberGuard. There's random ones that you can get on their mailing list. And once you're on there, they'll always email you. Vendors for the software and hardware that you buy will offer them. There are subscription services. The FBI sends some out. And then beyond just signing up for an advisory or an alert, take advantage of the tools you have. So if you've got a SIM and you're ingesting logs and it's giving you alerts, a lot of those SIMs are updated by the vendors to look for certain indicators of compromise or to look for certain vulnerabilities. And when they do, that triggers an alert. Essentially, that SIM is tied into the advisories that the vendor's receiving. So take advantage of that if you have it. Also take advantage of endpoint protection software. The software will alert you if you're receiving malware, if it's blocking malware, if it, there's all sorts of alerts that can come from that. So depending on how large and how robust your program is and the tools are, just look at each one of those and say, is there something in there that can help meet this control that I wasn't even aware of being offered to me? Updating malicious code protection mechanisms, pretty cut and dry in most cases nowadays. Antivirus signatures typically update on their own or pushed from a console when they're a managed service at an enterprise level. But some products don't rely on signatures. Some are reputation based, some are mathematical algorithms. So what you're really looking for here is, are my agents and my technologies and my signatures up to date? Is the operating system patched and up to date? My vendor security patches, are they applied? And then I put a bullet here, many of the same items that are on previous slide with 3.14.2, because there's going to be quite a bit of overlap here. So looking at everything you have, is it up to date? Now, I did want to throw a note in here that we're typically cautious in both the IT/security fields of going to the newest release of any piece of software as it comes out, because it hasn't necessarily been tested long enough to find vulnerabilities. A lot of vendors use their client base as their testing. So they may do some alpha or beta testing just to make sure that the product doesn't physically break and not work. But once they have guaranteed that it works, they'll push it out there, and then they rely on people to test it and provide them feedback via support channels of vulnerabilities that are found, things of that nature. So one of the common themes you'll find is that when you upgrade a piece of software because you want to close a security vulnerability, the upgrade will close that vulnerability and often open a new one. You may not know what the new one is when it's being upgraded, but it'll be found later. So what a lot of organizations will employ is what we call an N minus and then a number. So N minus 1, N minus 2, N minus 3. And at that point, N is your newest available release. And then you're going to go back, say, N minus 3 up to 3 releases. So as long as you're within one of those last 3 releases, that's okay. Some also use it from if I'm N minus 2, I'm not going to go to anything newer than the first 2. So within your organization, you want to define what that process is going to be. Maybe you will allow, you don't want the newest, you're willing to go to the second newest, and you don't want it to be more than 5 versions old. And that's just the process you put in place. And then you've got to search for those to make sure that you don't have anything exceeding that 5 versions old. Now, one of the challenges with this is that as you go through an inventory all of your applications, vendors release things on different cycles. Some vendors will, I'm aware of that, will do it as lax as quarterly. So you may only get 4 updates for the entire year. There are other vendors that are literally releasing patches and updates daily and weekly. So an N-3 works fine on one application and not the other. You certainly don't want to go 9 months without upgrading, but you don't want to limit yourself to, I have to upgrade every single week because within 3 weeks I've violated my own process. So it seems pretty common sense, but I'm telling you, it's a little bit more challenging to actually track depending on how much software you have. Now, if you've gone another route and you just say that I'm going to auto update with like Microsoft patches, for example, then you've essentially solved this problem. But again, you're at the mercy that something doesn't break. Performing periodic scans of your systems and real-time scans of files as things are downloaded, open, and executed. That's fairly simple and common with today's endpoint protection services. For example, we use a SentinelOne product that is constantly doing real-time scans. So it's not necessarily scanning your file system nonstop. Like when you go into a service and right-click on something and say scan now. But what it's doing is it's sitting there in like a listening, watching, monitoring mode. And as soon as you go and download something, it immediately goes, oh, I've detected something's downloaded, let me scan it. Some of the tools, Microsoft and others, will actually tell you if you open up like an Excel file, and there'll be a little warning banner that says Microsoft cannot guarantee the validity of this file and the safety because it's in the middle of a scan. And if you give it a couple seconds, it'll complete. So each vendor does it a little different, but that's examples of real-time scanning that you don't have to do anything as long as you own those products as it's taking place. Periodic scans, on the other case, probably speak more to the vulnerability scans where you're catching your outdated software and missing patches. Pen testing, which a lot of organizations now through cyber insurance requirements, client requirements, contract requirements are moving to a minimum of annual by a third party, just so that you can check a compliance box and make sure you're doing these things. Scheduling antivirus scans to block malware. Again, I've already covered real time. And then getting into kind of the little subsets down here, the static and dynamic code testing, if you're developing code and you want to check for these things prior to deploying into production. You can also use vendor configuration scans and tools to find suboptimal security configurations. So as an example, Microsoft offers one for Office, I believe it is, where you can go out there and see how your licensing is configured, what's an available security option for you at each license package. Do you have it enabled? And they'll pump out a score so you can see how well or how poorly you're doing. There are other tools where you can, in conjunction with, say, a vulnerability scan, go out and use a benchmark like a CIS benchmark. And you can say, please go scan this host and tell me how, from a configuration standpoint, I match up with the CIS benchmark. And it'll score you, it'll tell you how well you're doing, it'll tell you where you need to remediate. And as you remediate those things, then they ideally become your new baseline that, when we talked about file integrity monitoring earlier in the presentation, you're bouncing your baseline off of, looking for changes. So again, lots of different things that are available to you. They are not that difficult to implement. Cost, again, is dependent upon which vendor you go with and how big of an organization you are, what kind of discounts you get. If you're under a federal contractor discount versus private sector, et cetera. And then monitor organizational systems, including outbound and inbound communication, looking for attacks and indicators of potential attacks or indicators of compromise. One of the easiest, I think, external ones to look at would be monitoring system boundaries for events that could turn into successful attacks. And I use example dynamic denial of service. So if you're an organization who deals with having a website that brings a lot of traffic and maybe e-commerce, I use something like an Amazon as an example, and they're leading up to a Black Friday sale, they're going to want to make sure that they pay for both a physical appliance and or software that can help with load balancing and blocking denial of service attacks so that their website doesn't go down. But they also want to be monitoring for these types of things in advance to see if, maybe today the hardware that they have, whether it be physical or virtual, can handle the amount of traffic that's being sent to it to include those people who are trying to attack them. But as they ramp up their business model for Black Friday, it could be overwhelmed. You're going to have to look for these specific types of use cases with your organization and see if any apply. For a lot of folks, it's just monitoring, closing ports and making sure that everything is configured, that maybe you're doing geo blocking, little minor stuff that you can do to take care of the external. On the internal traffic, though, you can review audit logs, you can get your SIM set up to do alerting. We can use antivirus like we talked about earlier that will provide alerting. You may want to go a step further than the SIM and implement a true intrusion detection or prevention system, an IDS or IPS, where it sits in line and can either just copy traffic and alert you of potential things that are happening, or it can go into a full-on blocking mode and automate the blocking on your behalf. Again, some of these are expensive technologies, but would check the box and would actually improve your security posture dramatically above and beyond checking a box from a compliance perspective. Looking at remote connections, how they take place, how they're initiated, where they're coming from, as well as making sure that communication is initiated from outside the organization. The last thing that you would want is the internal organization going out and establishing a connection. That's often a sign of malware and backdoors that are set up. And finally, the identifying unauthorized use of organizational systems. Quite a few here. I listed kind of the top most common ones here, as well as a bullet at the bottom for monitoring the types of access that are found, and using a couple previous slides as references to how you can do it, because it's the same types of tools and technologies. That's, again, one of the things that makes this domain a little bit simpler, that one set of tools can be used to meet multiple controls. But you're going to be looking for things like, access to wireless access points. Those could be internal in your physical infrastructure network, someone getting on it. It could be from outside of a building connecting to it. You could have, two different floors in a building where one company's on one floor, one's on the other, but the signal's strong enough that they're connecting to your network. Looking for any rogue devices that were placed on the network. And by rogue device, we're really referring to any corporate asset or any unauthorized asset. So you might allow people to come in with, say, a personal laptop, but your intent is the personal laptop can only connect to a guest network, and should they show up on the corporate network, that would be deemed a rogue device. Remote connections from external users and devices. A lot of these would be anticipated and expected, but there's got to be a way to make sure you're identifying them and being able to rule out which ones are authorized and which ones aren't, as well as, again, the backdoors into the environment. And on that note, that concludes all of the 7 controls for this domain, as well as wrapping up the entire CMMC component, if you will, of NIST 171 R2. So if there are any questions, please feel free to ask. Otherwise, I want to thank everybody who's attended this session and the others for sticking around for the CMMC portion. And come January, we will be migrating off of CMMC and going back to more traditional, each month having a different topic completely. Okay. If there are no questions, I appreciate everyone's time, and you guys have a great Christmas and New Year's. Thank you.